Have you ever thought about giving as, more than just a single action? We talk about giving all the time, but what if there's a more structured way to think about it? Today, we're diving into a really fascinating framework, one that's drawn directly from an interpretation of New Testament teachings that presents giving not as one simple act, but as a structured four-part system. So let's get into it. So the first question we got to ask is this: is all giving created equal? Is a donation to a charity the same thing as the money you put in an offering plate on Sunday? The answer is a big, clear no. Different types of giving have totally different purposes. And this whole idea of structure is really grounded in this core principle from 1 Corinthians, let all things be done decently and in order. The whole idea is that different kinds of giving are actually for different purposes, and, they produce very different results. So instead of just lumping all giving into one big bucket, the Bible breaks it down into four specific categories, and each one has its own motivation, its own destination, and its own promised outcome. It actually operates within a divine system of order. Alright, so here's our roadmap. We'll kick things off with the concept of a divine system itself. Then we're going to break down the four distinct dimensions. You've got the tithe, first fruits, alms, and seed. And finally, we'll pull it all together and see how it forms a complete financial blueprint. Okay, so let's start with that foundational idea, order. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of the what and the how, the Bible really insists that we first have to understand the why, that giving is meant to be seen as this organized, intentional system. So here's the core idea you really have to get. There are four separate, and this is the key word, non-interchangeable categories of giving. Each one has its own unique motivation, its own designated recipient, and its own specific promised outcome. And here's the kicker. This is the crucial point from this teaching. You can't mix and match. For example, giving your tithe, which we'll define in just a second, to a charity, that would be seen as miscategorizing it. Doing this doesn't just change the outcome, it actually cancels the specific blessing that was intended for that act. So how does this system actually work in practice? Well, it all starts with the first dimension, the tithe. And this is presented not as an act of generosity, not just as some old rule from the past, but as a principle that's still very much alive for the New Testament believer. Really as an act of obedience. It's presented as a specific slice that belongs to God, and giving it is directly linked to unlocking divine protection and blessing in your life. And this is huge for understanding the New Testament justification for this idea. Jesus' words here are interpreted to mean, hey, just like there's a part for the government, for Caesar, there's a distinct part that belongs to God. This is really the foundational scripture for continuing the tithe. Alright, let's break down the tithes. The motivation here isn't about charity or even generosity, it's straight up obedience. Tithe literally just means a tenth, so we're talking about the first 10% of your income. According to the Bible, its proper recipient is your local church, or what the Bible calls the storehouse. Basically, the place you're spiritually fed. And the promised result is super specific. It opens the windows of heaven and rebukes the devourer, which is described as this destructive force against your finances. And this whole concept comes right out of scripture, like this verse from Malachi. It's even presented as a direct challenge from God, saying, try me now in this, and see what happens. So in this framework, tithing is really the key that unlocks divine financial protection and provision. Okay, let's move on to our second category and see how this all builds. This one is called first fruits, and its uniqueness is right there in the name. It's all about what comes first. So the motivation here is totally different. This isn't about obligation in the same way the tithe is. First fruits is described as an offering driven by pure generosity. It's a way to show that God, not money, has first place in your heart. And the promised result? A specific blessing on your home. This verse from Romans is what really anchors this principle in the New Testament. The idea is that by offering the first fruit, you're setting the stage for everything that follows. By making that first part holy, the rest gets consecrated too. So first fruits is the first and the best of any increase you get. Think about it like this. If you get a pay raise, the first fruits offering would be the entire amount of that first new, bigger paycheck. It's something you give once per harvest cycle, so maybe yearly, and it's really an expression of gratitude and trust. The promise attached to it, your barns will be filled with plenty, and a blessing will rest on your whole house. And you can see this principle spelled out right here in Proverbs. It directly connects honoring God with the first fruits of all your increase to a promise of overflowing abundance. The whole idea is that when you put God first with any new blessing, it kind of sanctifies everything that comes after it. Our third category kind of shifts the focus. We're moving from our relationship with God to our relationship with other people. This is almsgiving, and it's all about putting compassion into actual practice. Almsgiving is a direct response to seeing someone in need, and it's motivated purely by compassion. But here's the key to this concept. The instruction is to do it in secret. The idea is that the reward isn't praise from other people, but a private reward that comes from God. And wow, this verse just powerfully captures the spirit of almsgiving. It poses a really direct challenge. If you have the means to help, and you don't, how can you say the love of God is in you? It frames this type of giving as a real indicator of where you're at spiritually. And get this, the promised result isn't multiplication, but reimbursement and an open reward from God. This verse from Proverbs is really the cornerstone for the whole alms principle. It literally frames giving to the poor as lending directly to God with the explicit promise that He will pay it back. It's like a guaranteed loan, but the return is reimbursement, not a multiplied harvest. See the difference? Finally, we get to the fourth type, seed giving. This one uses this really powerful farming metaphor that's central to the whole concept, the idea of sowing to reap a harvest. Here, the motivation is all about faith. You're not just giving something away. You are intentionally planting a seed with the very real expectation of a multiplied return. This concept is tied directly to the parable of the sower, which highlights that promise of a 30, 60, or even 100-fold harvest. This verse from Galatians establishes seed giving as this firm, unwavering principle. It's presented almost like a law of the universe, like gravity. What you put into the ground is what's going to grow back. Your sowing directly determines your reaping. And it's framed as a pure act of faith, an investment you make expecting a specific return. So a seed is an offering you sow with the clear expectation of a harvest. Now the recipient here is critical. It has to be sown in what's called good ground, meaning a ministry or an individual that is spiritually fruitful. And the result is unlike any of the others, a multiplied harvest, described as 30, 60, or even 100 times what you sowed. The quickest way to overcome poverty. The principle here is pretty simple and direct. Just like it says in 2 Corinthians, the size of your seed determines the size of your harvest. It's a farming metaphor applied to finance. What you put in directly correlates to what you get out, but with this promise of supernatural multiplication. Okay, this contrast is one of the most important distinctions in this whole framework. Let's just look at it side by side. When you give alms out of compassion, the promise is reimbursement. You get back what you gave. But when you give a seed out of faith, the promise is a multiplied harvest. This is exactly why you can't give a seed to the poor and expect a 100-fold return. That's not its purpose. The category you choose determines the outcome you get. And that brings us to the key that holds this entire framework together. The central rule is simple. You need 4 separate baskets. So here's the crucial point. These categories are not interchangeable. The argument is that God is a God of order, and because of that, you can't substitute one type of giving for another and expect the same result. The tithe has its purpose, and almsgiving has its own. This slide illustrates what the framework calls the rate of exchange. When a tithe is given correctly to the church, it unlocks its intended blessing of divine protection. But if that same tithe money is rerouted as alms, the argument is that you've altered the exchange rate and you've forfeited the specific blessing you are after. All right, let's put it all together one more time. The tithe, driven by obedience, brings you protection. First fruits, from a place of generosity, brings abundance. Alms, from compassion, brings reimbursement. And seed, from faith, brings multiplication. When you see it all laid out like this, it's not just a list of things to do, it's a comprehensive strategy that is designed to cover every single aspect of your financial life. So, the real takeaway here is that this isn't just a list of suggestions, but a deeply interconnected system. And seeing it all laid out like this, with each part having such a distinct purpose and promise, is a really different way of looking at giving, isn't it? So let's do a quick recap. We've got the tithe, driven by obligation for divine protection. We have first fruits, which comes from generosity for holiness. Then there's alms, from compassion for a heavenly reward. And finally, seed giving, driven by faith for a multiplied harvest. 4 very distinct pathways. And that's the big takeaway from this whole framework. It presents this highly structured view of giving. And that leads us to our final question. Is money just a temporary tool for us to use here on earth, or can it be something more? Can it be an eternal investment? A way to take something that will fade away and use it to create something that lasts forever by changing lives for the gospel? The answer to that question is the very heart of financial stewardship.